Okay, thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction, and sincere thanks to Dan and Cody for the invitation to participate in this uncommon meeting that is trying to optimize functional aging. You know, somebody after dinner last night said to me, "Hey, are you the guy that has the really long title of your talk?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me." And then they asked, "Well, is it going to be dry and academic?" And I said, as dryly as I could, "I don't think so." Well, let's try it out. 75 years ago, the Spanish philosopher Ortega was delivering a lecture at the University of Madrid in Spain. And as he prepared to deliver the lecture, he asked the audience this question: what is the most valuable thing a speaker can give you? Okay, what might that be? Well, possibility is that it's information. That's the most valuable thing that a speaker can give to you. What about the possibility that if the speaker calls his information facts, does that make it more valuable to you? And the other possibility is the most valuable thing a speaker can give the audience, is need. In other words, point out the things that are missing. So Ortega continues this intellectual exercise, and eventually he decides that the most valuable thing a speaker can give an audience is disorientation. And in fact, I would say, and I think Ortega would agree with me, that the most valuable thing a speaker can do is put you today, in this hour that we spend together, in a state of perpetual disorientation, reorientation. Now, before you get whacked out on how strange this seems, think for a moment. What is a creative life? If you dedicate your life to discovery and progress, you will find yourself in a continuous state of disorientation and reorientation. So today, my goal is to introduce you to several things that will violate your previous training and your preconceived notions. And by doing that, then we will be taking a page out of the American philosopher Mark Twain's book, who wrote, "Education consists mainly in what we have unlearned." So it's not until we unlearn that we get our richest learning experience. So my charge today is to explore with you the biology behind highly successful aging. I'm going to do this in the spirit of One Health. In other words, the idea that people, pets, and other animals are all in the same boat when it comes to health, disease, and aging. Just like we did 10 years ago when we published this paper in Scientific American called Cancer Clues from Pet Dogs, which explored the similarities and differences of the naturally occurring cancers that affect people and pets. In other words, it created the conceptual framework and benchmark progress in this field called comparative oncology. Pets and people are in the same boat when it comes to aging and cancer. So, the first story I'm going to tell you is about grizzly bears. You can walk out now if this is making you uncomfortable. This is a great paper that was published 2 years ago in Cell Metabolism. Did anybody read this? Okay, so what were the investigators doing? The investigators were studying obesity, and they were troubled by this, that it appears that these two things, obesity and insulin resistance, are tied at the hip. We have an obesity epidemic, and if obesity is present, we also have insulin resistance, right? But what do grizzly bears do? Before each hibernation, they tank up with body fat, but they're not diabetic and they're not sick. So what are grizzly bears doing? And the investigators go on to show that grizzly bears can shut off two metabolic pathways that enable them to be obese but not have insulin resistance. So what I just told you is a new idea let's call it grizzly wisdom, can separate two things that were thought to be joined together. And if we can't tame the obesity epidemic, maybe we can diminish the adverse effects of obesity on health. And I would encourage you to think about, in your domain of training and movement science, what's the new idea that could push two things apart that your field thinks are inextricably tied together? If I don't show you one in my field, you have to ask me that question at the end. The investigators said they were studying extreme natural biology to get clues to what the problem is with obesity and insulin resistance. Another example of extreme natural biology is the scientists that study 100-year-old people, so-called centenarians. Thomas Pearls runs the New England Centenarian study. And this is a picture of Neva Morris when she was 114 years old and the oldest living woman in the United States. My study subjects don't wear big floppy hats. We're testing a new idea, and it's the secrets of successful aging can be found by studying the oldest old dogs. So we have launched at the Gerald P. Murphy Cancer Foundation Center for Exceptional Longevity Studies the first systematic study of the oldest living dogs in the United States, starting with the Rottweiler breed because they're cancer prone like us. And we wanted to understand this relationship between aging and cancer resistance. So in addition to creating a database, a rich database of medical record information and detailed information from questionnaires that were collected from owners, part of the research involves getting out and studying these dogs in their homes. And these ventures, scientific expeditions, I call Old Gray Muzzle Tours. The first in 2010 was featured in Good Morning America and USA Today. There's only about 10 or 15 of these dogs alive at any given time in the United States, and there's no substitute for firsthand observations. So I need to travel around the country and meet these dogs. So far, I've studied 100 of these dogs in their homes. Most veterinarians will maybe meet one of these in their entire career. The research is more than just cruising around the country, meeting cool dogs in their homes. This is an invitation by the National Academy of Sciences for me to write a perspective piece on the challenges and opportunities of utilizing pet dogs as a model for highly successful human aging, and this was published a while back. The research has also led to a TED Talk. Anybody here has seen the TED Talk? A few people. You should watch it. It's a 12-minute video on the Murphy Foundation website or YouTube. It's called The Oldest Dogs as Our Greatest Teachers. Get the words out of your eyes. Further recognition in the scientific community came at this scientific meeting, an international conference on gerontology and geriatrics, which was held in Seoul, Korea. And the cool thing about this was, if you happen to be in Symposium 27, you witnessed for the first time at a scientific conference that you witnessed data from 100-year-old dogs side by side 100-year-old people. That's One Health. So that's pretty cool. So as we go deeper and deeper into the process of science, what are we learning? I think the overarching umbrella is this, that biology is counterintuitive. It's more counterintuitive than we think. What that means is we have to do the studies, because if we just act simply on guessing, we're going to be wrong a lot of the time. So I thought I would show you some examples of biology being counterintuitive. Are you up for that? Yeah. Okay. We don't have to stand up or do lunges, but okay. So let's start with this. Cardiac arrhythmias are bad, right? Irregularities of the heart are bad, right? Okay, who knows this study? This is the CAS study, the cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine 25 years ago. This is a people study, and the investigators are studying people who had heart attacks, because after a heart attack, you're prone to cardiac arrhythmias, irregularity of the heart. So this study tests 2 new drugs to try to knock out those arrhythmias. The results of the study, both drugs work compared to the placebo control, but at a cost. The people who get the drugs die sooner. Okay, obesity is bad, right? In general, we think that obesity is bad, right? But people in the heart failure field recognize what is called the obesity paradox. Has anyone heard of the obesity paradox before? There's a couple hands up. It turns out that being overweight or obese increases your risk of developing heart failure. But once you develop heart failure, being obese or overweight improves your prognosis. You live longer. Okay, now more recently, investigators are saying, hey, is the obesity paradox something particular with heart failure, or does it extend beyond that? And here's work from investigators at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, where they looked at 3,000 consecutive human cases of kidney cancer. And they ask, are there differences between the kidney cancers that develop in overweight and obese people as opposed to lean people? The answer is 2/3 of the people that develop kidney cancer are obese or overweight. But those that develop kidney cancer have a better prognosis. Their tumors are more tame. In fact, you can do gene profiling and they have a completely different gene expression. In other words, I just told you that the kidney cancers that develop in an obesogenic environment have a more aggressive behavior than those that develop in a lean host. All right, are you disoriented yet? Sufficiently? Okay, hang in there, 2 more examples. Here, this one hits closer to home. Exercise is good for you, right? I think we believe that. But then there's this study. Is anybody familiar with this study? This study looks at the association between exercise and your risk of dying of influenza. And what this study showed is that people with the highest physical activity level had the highest mortality for influenza, the same as sedentary individuals. And you optimize your resistance to influenza mortality by having moderate exercise. More recently, you might have heard of this. This study was featured on CNN last year. This is from the Copenhagen Heart Study, looking at the association of jogging intensity with overall mortality in a large group of people in Europe. And what did they find? Highest overall mortality in the most intense jogging and sedentary people, lowest mortality in moderate activity. What I just described to you fits this idea that we've called U-shaped thinking. In other words, good things don't keep getting gooder and gooder. And we're going to talk about this later. We'll address this later in the talk when we talk about the factors that limit scientific discovery. Final example of counterintuitiveness. Antioxidant supplements are good for you, right? I see several people shaking their heads. Who's familiar with this study by Ristow that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences? This is a study of people. This was performed in Germany. You have exercise people in a 4-week training program, and it has beneficial effects. It has beneficial effects on regulating blood sugar. But now, if the people do that training program and receive high-dose antioxidants, it blocks the beneficial effects of exercise. Okay, in the past, I've written a newspaper commentary on health, and when I described this study, I called this when 1 + 1 = 0. In other words, the idea that 2 so-called good things could cancel out. What do you think about this? Does this sound strange, or do you say the organism works best when it sees its environment? And apparently, in this instance, antioxidants shielded the organism from seeing exercise, and therefore it didn't have the beneficial effects on blood sugar control. All right, amidst all the counterintuitiveness, what should we do? I say we have to keep digging. And we have to increase our tools. The physicist Freeman Dyson said it eloquently: science flourishes best when it uses freely all the tools at hand, unconstrained by preconceived notions of what science ought to be. Every time we introduce a new tool, it always leads to new and unexpected discoveries, because nature's imagination is richer than ours. That sounds about right. One of those new tools, we believe, is to collect aging clues, from the oldest living dogs who are cancer resistant. We also need to change our attitudes, and one of them is we have to give up this idea that we're so certain about everything. In our research group, we've stopped using the word KNOW. Just think how many times a day with your clients you use this word. We know that blah, blah, blah. We know that blah, blah, blah. What you really mean is we believe that blah, 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 or we understand that blah, 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 right? Because this word gives a false sense of certainty. It's the stop sign for further inquiry. My son teaches fourth grade science, and I say, when you teach about the planets, do you say, we know that Neptune is a planet that circulates around the sun every so often? Or do you just tell them, Neptune's a planet that circulates around the sun? If you do it the first way, no hands go up, because we know has shut off any inquiry. But if you just make the statement, then the kids' hands go up and say, how was that measured? Did different people measure? Did they agree? So I think we need to change our attitude about this. The information will always be incomplete, and we have to take action as practitioners, as investigators, based upon incomplete information. So we can do well to get rid of this word. So here's where the talk is going to go. In the first, I'm going to introduce you to tenets of biogerontological thought, and by that I mean is let's explore some of the questions that scientists who study the biology of aging wonder about. Then we'll move to exploring the limits of interdisciplinary discovery, the idea that our discovery is going to be limited by certain things, and how might we improve? In other words, what's missing? And then lastly, I'll attempt some sort of useful synthesis. If I'm right on track, and I do this perfectly, everything I say will add up perfectly, like this road sign in Colorado. Snowmass Village, established 1967, elevation 8388, population 1449, total 11,804. But perhaps what I have to say here won't add up perfectly for you, so I'll give you the take-home messages here. I'm going to talk a lot about discovery, but I want to emphasize that I believe all practitioners are potential discoverers, and you should see yourselves as practitioners as the front line discoverers, because you're generating firsthand observations of functional aging in your communities. So you guys are discoverers. We're all discoverers. And I think that, for the most part, we've been educated, and therefore we think, this is how we believe, science is a subject matter. Science is a collection of facts, a body of knowledge. And what I want to try to do today is balance out that perception and show you that science is a method. It's a method of inquiry in any domain when we decide to try to make better sense of the world. And ultimately, my goal will be to show you that science is a method limited by language. Whoa. Because scientists and health professionals are not trained in language precision. That's really problematic, right? Language limits what we can perceive. In other words, what we get out of each observation, each encounter. Language limits what we can express, what ideas we communicate to other people. So language limits the scientific method. And so the actionable item is we need to place more emphasis on training young scientists and health professionals in precision with language. We just don't do this. Work with language precision is preserved for poets, historians, writers, not scientists or health professionals. And that puts us at disadvantage. Okay, so let's get started first with what are the goals of biogerontological research. And let's start out by saying it's not the reversal of aging, it's not immortality, but instead it's compression of morbidity and increasing health span. And if you haven't heard that word before, health span, that's a word that you're going to hear more and more of. In other words, what we want to do is compress morbidity. We want the longest life we can have free of disease, free of morbidity, and free of disability. That's compression of morbidity, and that's what health span is. And that's the framework now that is changing in the biology of aging research. So let's address some questions. What percentage of longevity is heritable? In other words, if you know how long your parents lived, how confident can you be you know how long you will live? Anybody want to yell out a multiple choice? I don't know what the ribbons are all about. That should be 0 to 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, okay? All right, anybody want to take brave guesses? All right, what I'm hearing, I think, is around 20 to 40. And this is a very, very enlightened group because the correct answer from human twin studies is about 25 to 30%. So give yourselves a hand. But really what you just did was, you said this, lifestyle matters, right? We're preaching to the choir here. So in other words, longevity is not genetically hardwired to the extent that we can ignore lifestyle choices. This is an important thing because if the correct answer was 80% or 85%, then we could all go home, right? Because then everybody is hardwired for a certain longevity. There's a scientific term for this, and it's called plasticity. There's plasticity to longevity. That means that we can try to dream up the most effective interventions. Okay, another question. What organisms are most commonly used to study factors that influence the aging process? Who are our workhorses when it comes to animal species? Rats and mice, I heard. Pelicans, did somebody say? Maybe that person can leave. No, we're being open-minded here. Okay, so in the interest of time, the correct answer is yeast, worms, flies, and mice in cages. Now, immediately, I hope, I've created a disconnect here. We said we're shooting for health span, right? We're shooting for healthy longevity, and yet these are the workhorses. So I'm going to say to you tomorrow when you go back home, what are you going to do that is particularly worm-like? No, you're going to climb stairs, your heart is going to be functioning, you're going to be communicating with people. So what we need, in addition to these animal model systems, is animal models that will help us with this stuff, so-called phenotypes, like heart function and mobility and so forth, that relate to human aging. And that's, again, health span, healthy longevity, functional aging. And I think that's where the oldest old dogs can help. So another question, what is the only intervention that can consistently extend longevity in rodents? Correct answer is caloric restriction. I think that was the same penguin guy. He's rallied. He's come back from penguin. No, he's just vocal. Okay, so it's caloric restriction. And this is the first paper that got the ball rolling, McKay's paper, 1935 from Cornell University, showing that caloric restriction, meaning 30 to 40% decrease in calories, can significantly extend longevity in rodents. This is not starvation. This is 30 to 40% caloric restriction, no micronutrient deficiencies. So that's caloric restriction. So study after study in rodents has said this is a winner. More recently, there's data suggesting that caloric restriction could delay the onset of age-related disease in Rhesus monkeys. If you look at the vertical axis here, this is the percentage of monkeys that are free of age-related disease, and this is the calorically restricted group, which remains freer and has a delayed onset of age-related disease. So that's impressive data in non-human primates. But 30 to 40% caloric restriction is not practical for humans. Imagine your kid's bus driver on 30 to 40% caloric restriction. That person is driving around looking around for the Arby's hat, right? So the race is on. The race is on. Scientists are trying to find what are called caloric restriction mimetics. This will be a pill that will mimic the physiologic effects of caloric restriction. So you won't restrict your calories, but you'll brush your teeth at night and take this caloric restriction mimetic. So the race is on for that, to try to slow down the rate of aging. But before we fall in love with caloric restriction as the one-size-fits-all, we got to look at this study. This was a study published in Aging Cell 2010, and these investigators did something very, very interesting. They bucked the system. They said, let's take 47 different, genetically different strains of mice that were actually created for some sort of alcoholism experiment, but they're genetically different strains of mice, 47. And now we'll compare full-fed mice and calorically restricted mice. It had never done before in such a large way. And what did they find? Their results were incredible, because it turns out that there are just as many strains of mice that caloric restriction cut short longevity as caloric restriction increased longevity. Okay, so the notion in biology that one size fits all is dead in the water, right? That's an oversimplification. Now we have to turn our attention to who will benefit. That's the big question. Who will benefit from any intervention, from any lifestyle choice? All right, another question. What's the role of oxidative stress in aging? This is a popular concept. It's been around since Denham Harman introduced it in 1956. Your body produces reactive oxygen species as these attack your macromolecules, can damage your proteins, damage your DNA to create mutations. So it's reasonable that oxidative stress can drive the aging process. Perhaps the best information, most compelling information, is this paper from Melov that was published 15 years ago or so. This is a worm study, and what Melov showed was you could take worms and you could have them roll around in a chemical that upregulated their antioxidant defenses, SOD, right? You guys know superoxide dismutase, SOD, which is one of our most potent antioxidant enzymes. And what happened? The worms lived longer. In fact, you could rescue genetically impaired short-lived worms by having them roll around in this chemical that upregulated their antioxidant defenses. So pretty compelling information that oxidative stress controls aging or regulates aging. But the enthusiasm in that idea rapidly diminished when this study was published. This is the study I call the home run study, where investigators tried to take that worm data that was so exciting and see whether or not the same thing would hold true for mammals. And in this study, where they genetically upregulate antioxidant defenses in mice, there's no beneficial effect on longevity. And previously, I showed you the Ristow paper, where the combination of antioxidants and exercise, antioxidants blocks the beneficial effects of exercise. I think what it shows us is how little we know about the role of oxidative stress in aging and age-related diseases. Okay, so amidst all of this, maybe our problem is that we need a better conceptual framework. In other words, how we think. And 2 years ago, I published a paper, a perspective paper, and here's a quote from that paper. For although the biology of successful aging is unquestionably complicated, you've seen that today, the mathematics of solid progress in this area is surprisingly simple. LCP plus WOT equals SA. And of course, there will be a quiz on that afterwards. What I was referring to is, in my experience, teaching a graduate course on the biology of aging at Purdue for 15 years, there are two underutilized concepts in our thinking about successful aging. And they are life course perspective and whole organism thinking. So what I mean by that is that life course perspective is the idea that early life events influence late life health outcomes. Sociologists get this completely. Biologists are slow on the uptake. We think, give me an old zebra, give me an old camel, give me an old mouse, and I'll study aging. But sociologists know that early life events have a strong influence on adult health outcomes. If you embrace the idea of life course perspective, then you seek to create successful aging trajectories by making superior early choices. So that's the life course perspective concept. And whole organism thinking is the idea that we're in an age of specialization, yet we need to pay closer attention to trade-offs. If I say to the men in the audience, behind my back I have a pill, it'll drop your prostate cancer risk in half, but it'll double your Alzheimer's disease risk, you want it? So everybody's going like this. They just did whole organism thinking. But usually when you receive news of a new intervention, you only hear one side of it, right? Because the prostate cancer researcher is excited about the new agent that will decrease prostate cancer risk, doesn't care about the brain. And so that's problematic. So if you embrace this whole organism thinking, you're going to pay closer attention to trade-offs. You're going to see every intervention as both good and bad. That's your starting point. It's both good and bad. And if they only tell you the good part, you must ask about the bad. Okay, let's try to apply a life course perspective to successful aging. I told you, this is the idea that early life events influence adult health outcomes. Very interesting work by a guy named Vince Felitti in California as part of what is called the ACE study. Does anybody know the ACE study? Adverse Childhood Events study. He took a large database of information on adults, the health outcome of adults, and then gathered information on adverse childhood events. Whether or not there was a death of a parent, whether there was abuse in the home, whether or not the brother is in jail. And it turns out that if you have a lot of adverse childhood events, you're more likely to have a higher mortality and diabetes, for example. So you have adverse adult health outcomes because of adverse childhood events. That's life course perspective. And in another paper, Felitti published this. Incredibly, the more adverse childhood events that people have, the more likely they develop lung cancer. Now, does anybody have an easy explanation for that association? People who have adverse childhood events are more likely to smoke as a coping mechanism. But what do the investigators do? They control for smoking exposure. And the association between adverse childhood events and lung cancer remains. So it can't be explained simply by smoking exposure. Incredible. All right, one of the goals that biogerontologists have is to identify biomarkers to predict successful aging. In other words, I want to measure in you, collect non-invasively. It can't be a part of your brain, but you'll give me a urine sample or hair or skin cells or something non-invasive. And I would use that to try to identify a biomarker that would show that people are aging at significantly different rates. Do you see the advantage of that? Then, when we're investigating interventions, we wouldn't have to wait for death to be the end point. We could just watch how a biomarker moves in a 6-month trial and be very confident about finding new interventions. So I asked this question: could paying closer attention to life course perspective fit together some of the pieces of the biomarker puzzle? And it's because of this is why I think it's true. If we study aging over the life course carefully, we find that there's a flip-flop of physiology, what I call a flip-flop of physiology, and I'm going to show you 2 examples of that. So there is a lady named Kivipelto in Scandinavia. She's a terrific researcher. She's trying to investigate what are predictors at age 50 of you getting Alzheimer's disease 20 years in the future. And the results of her work suggest that high serum cholesterol at age 50 is associated with the increased risk 20 years later. So that's the most reliable predictor. That's interesting because in people who are 70, high cholesterol appears to be protective against Alzheimer's disease. Okay, I know you want to say high cholesterol is good or bad. I know that it's human nature to do this, to simplify health messages, but you see how you're at risk. We're all at risk because we try to oversimplify into either orness, good or bad, and whole organism thinking teaches us good and bad, every intervention and choice. Okay, is obesity a predictor of poor survival? We think obesity is a so-called bad thing. But with increasing age, fatness loses its sting as a harbinger of death, and in fact, in advanced age, favorable survival may be more closely linked to greater adiposity, fat, than muscle mass. Wow. Does that sound weird? Why might this be true? See, you should be skeptical and say, this doesn't make any sense. But when grandma falls at the mailbox, is she going to break her hip? Or if she's a little more obese, she's going to bounce. And she's not going to have the fracture. She won't have the pathologic fracture that causes her decline. And, I know that's funny, the other possibility is, what if grandma breaks her hip, goes into the hospital and gets a nosocomial infection, gets an infection in the hospital? Does she have the energy reserves to fight through the pneumonia? Not if she's lean, but maybe if she's a little heavier. Okay, so being obese at 35, that seems really bad, but maybe at 85, not so much. Okay, so perhaps what we should be thinking about is this idea of resilience. And resilience is a term that's usually used to describe psychological resilience, right? Your ability to bounce back from a psychological challenge. I'm talking about physiologic resilience, your ability to bounce back after a physiologic challenge. Why does this make sense? It's because the functional state of any organism reflects its attempt to adapt to environmental changes. And if you don't believe me, you should read this book. Does anybody know this book, The Organism? There's a neurologist named Kurt Goldstein, and he studied spinal cord injured World War I soldiers. And what Goldstein wanted to figure out is the symptoms that these soldiers were showing him. Did that reflect the insult? In other words, their trauma, or the body's response to the insult? Wow, that's a deep question. Want to read Goldstein? This is what Goldstein wrote in 1935. That was a big year. McKay's paper on caloric restriction, too. We become so accustomed to regarding symptoms as direct expression of the damage that we tend to assume that corresponding to some given damage, definite symptoms must inevitably appear. We forget that normal as well as abnormal reactions, so-called symptoms, are only expressions of the organism's attempt to deal with certain demands of the environment. Wow. Goldstein sees symptoms as attempted solutions. Do you see that? Do you see your patient's symptoms as attempted solutions? If you do, you're thinking in an advanced way. So, based upon that, we might ask, what are the physiologic factors that favor an organism's high capacity for finding successful solutions in response to demands and/or illness? At the very least, we should probably start by looking at aging as a loss of physiologic resilience. Now, when I think of searching for factors that might impact physiologic resilience, I think of women. And I think of the longevity advantage that women have over men. This could be my most controversial slide. But it's accurate that when it comes to longevity, there is a well-understood or a well-documented longevity advantage in women. In fact, women are 4 times more likely than men to reach 100 years of age. Scientists who study supercentenarians, these are people that live to be 110. Right now, there are approximately 78 of these people that are validated in the world, 76 women, 2 men. So there's a female longevity advantage, and we don't understand why. Look at what the biogerontologist Stephen Austad wrote. Human sex differences in longevity may be the single most robust aspect of human biology that scientists do not understand, even in the broadest terms. So I have to confess here that I'm a card-carrying member of the OSSD, which is the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences. Any other members? Because we could hold hands together or something. All right, this deals with this is based upon the idea that sex differences in biology and health can serve as useful signposts of what are the determinants of adult health outcomes, right? So can we get clues from exploring male-female differences? So it's logical to ask a question, is healthy longevity influenced by ovaries? Could that be responsible for the female advantage? Well, it turned out that in 2009, we published the first paper from our exceptionally long-lived Rottweilers. And this was in Aging Cell. There are approximately 70 scientific journals devoted to gerontology and geriatrics. This is the top impact journal. Here was the paper, Exploring Mechanisms of Sex Differences in Longevity, Lifetime Overexposure, and Exceptional Longevity in Dogs. And in this, we were trying to see whether or not there was a female longevity advantage in dogs, because it had never been reported before, right? Well documented in women, but not reported in dogs. And what did we find? We found that females had a longevity advantage over males. They were twice as likely to reach the equivalent of 100 years old. But that female longevity advantage was erased if the ovaries were removed in the first 4 years. Whoa, that seems countercurrent to conventional wisdom. But now let's look at what was going on in science at that time. While our paper was being reviewed, peer-reviewed, this paper was published. Does anybody know this paper? William Parker, 29,000 women who underwent hysterectomy. About half of the women kept their ovaries, about half of the women lost their ovaries. What did Parker show? That if you're less than 50 years old and you're going to get a hysterectomy, you should probably hang on to your ovaries, because those women that kept their ovaries had decreased overall mortality, decreased cardiovascular mortality, even less lung cancer. Okay, we published our paper 3 months after it was published. This paper appears in the Journal of Gerontology. This is a mouse study. It's a mouse transplantation study where old female mice receive a transplant of young female mouse ovaries, and it pushes their longevity by 13%. So, in a period of 6 months, We had 3 investigators, 3 different species, this compelling convergence, all of the results pointing in this direction. Ovaries are part of a system that promotes longevity. Now, does this sound like a far-fetched idea? Yes. If your framework is ovaries are reproductive units, but ovaries are endocrine organs. That means they have system-wide effects on health. And hopefully, someday, when we train the next generation of health professionals, ovaries will join the ranks of other endocrine organs, right? Like adrenal glands and the thyroid gland, that we don't try to remove, we try to retain. So definitely we'll need future research to better define the impact of these endocrine changes, hormonal changes on functional aging. One of the things that we're working on in the oldest old dogs is we've started to examine stress and aging, and we've shown that the oldest old Rottweilers, 100-year-old Rottweilers, have the ability to sidestep the age-related increase in cortisol, stress hormone. This age-related increase was previously thought to be an inextricable, unchangeable part of aging, but it seems like these guys have found a way to not increase their cortisol levels. And you can go to the TED Talk to hear more about that. Okay, second part of the talk is exploring the limits of interdisciplinary discovery. How are we going to get better? We need tech readiness. You hear about that all the time. We need the very best technology. My argument is we need something else, and that's what I call linguistic readiness. This is an attitude of precision with language and also an attitude of listening with the intent of real change. I told you already, we have inadequate training in precision with language as health professionals and as scientists, and our words are our starting points. Think about that. Our words are our starting points for our current practice, for our ways of thinking, and our future inquiry. Think about seeing the world as vitamin E good or bad versus vitamin E good and bad. We need to learn to see language as a gateway to discovery because language is how we communicate, but it's also how we think. And the general semanticists put it this, Wendell Johnson put it this way: we see the world through our categories. And this either-orness, good or bad, that I showed you, distorts our thinking and our inquiry. Remember at the beginning of the talk when we were seeing health through the lens of either-orness. It was very disoriented, even disabling. And so these innocent questions like, is vitamin E good or bad? Is jogging good or bad? We need to replace that with this idea of seeing all interventions, including nutrient supplementation, as both good and bad. So, disease resistance is likely to be an important part of successful aging. Turns out that people who live to be 100 die of other stuff and not cancer. They're cancer resistant. And so I'll share with you now a little bit of data from the oldest old dogs regarding cancer resistance. It turns out Rottweilers are a cancer-prone breed, and if Rottweilers die with usual longevity, which is around 7 or 8 years of age, cancer is the cause of death 80% of the time. But the dogs that live to advanced age are cancer resistant. Their cancer mortality rate drops to about 25%. But here's the kicker. At autopsy, 95% of these dogs are harboring cancer. In other words, they have 2, 3, 4 different types of cancer, but they're walking around with it. So they've done what every scientist, cancer scientist, wants to understand. How do you transform cancer from lethality to this nuisance? In other words, you survive through cancer. You sidestep cancer mortality. So that's an opportunity for us to explore this question, which relates to strategy against cancer. How do we optimize the organism for successful aging and cancer avoidance? Do we try to prevent damage? That's what our priority is? Prevent damage or optimize response to damage? I think the conventional wisdom is we try to do things that prevent the damage to our bodies. That's sunscreen, that's antioxidant supplements, but over my career, I'm way more in this camp, that we should try to organize, to try to optimize the response to damage. And this comes from investigating the anti-cancer effects of selenium. I think most of you know selenium as an essential trace mineral. The conventional wisdom says selenium protects you against cancer because it prevents oxidative damage. It's part of glutathione peroxidase, one of your major antioxidant enzymes. But we did research in dogs and in the lab and showed a new mechanism of how selenium could fight off cancer. And it was by selectively sweeping away the most damaged cells. So that's an excuse to point out the power of neologism, this idea of forming new words. We had a new mechanism, we needed new words. Take a look at this statement. The new circumstances under which we are placed call for new words, new phrases, and for the transfer of old words to new objects. Necessity obliges us to neologize. Who said that? I guess I could have said that. Thomas Jefferson said it 200 years ago. He's the first guy to use the term neologize. If we have new discoveries, new language must go hand in hand. So we had a new mechanism for how selenium worked, we needed new words, and we called it homeostatic house cleaning. In other words, the ability of selenium to selectively sweep away the most damaged cells. We don't think this mechanism is peculiar to selenium. I think caloric restriction works this way. I think red wine, resveratrol in red wine works this way. And in the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, we proceeded to introduce the scientific community to the new language in this scientific publication. So I'll share one more neologism with you, and it relates to categories of information. We can categorize information all different ways. How about this? Scientific information versus non-scientific. That might be useful to us. How about first-hand information versus second-hand information? That might be useful to us as well in our thinking. But the question for you is, what do you call the information that clients believe based upon their research on the internet? And the answer to that is clientific. Now, at first glance, this is a neologism, and it seems just cute, but it's far more than cute because it forces you to think about how the public, how people respond to new medical information. It should force you to rethink your stances, your beliefs on current information, and how much clientific stuff you've got in your head. So I say, you need to become a neologistic discoverer. We all need to become neologistic discoverers, new language hand in hand. And so it's no mystery that we've got time to look at two things that limit scientific discovery, and both of them are going to be couched in language that was created by our research group. First, U-shaped thinking, and then we'll talk about naive substitution. So why is it so difficult to find the good things that promote health? Because the public has an oversimplified view of health promotion. It goes something like this: just show me the good things and I'll consume as much of them as I can. But is more really better? And it depends who your intellectual hero is. Aristotle with his golden mean, Goldilocks with the porridge that was just right. But this idea of more might not be better. My intellectual hero, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, put it this way: there are no monotone values in biology, right? Good things don't keep getting gooder and gooder. So, read from Bateson: desired substances, things, patterns, or sequences of experiences that are in some sense good for the organism are never such that more of the something is always better than less of the something. Rather, for all objects and experiences, there's a quantity that has optimum value. We say it's a U-shaped world. And where you want to be is in this optimum middle. That's the best place to be. So let me tell you a story that illustrates that. In 2000, the National Cancer Institute launched the largest ever prostate cancer prevention trial. Cody worked with our group at the Murphy Foundation on this trial. It was called SELECT. Does anybody know this trial? We were one of the 400 sites. We enrolled 32,000 men. It's a $175 million study, largest ever prostate cancer prevention trial. And the idea was, could vitamin E, selenium, or both decrease a man's risk for prostate cancer? So daily supplementation with a nutrient. At the time that the trial started, there were two important questions that were unanswered. What's the mechanism of selenium, and what's the most effective dose? And that's what we're going to focus on. So we did a randomized feeding trial in elderly beagle dogs who were the physiologically equivalent to the guys in the SELECT trial. They're about 65 years of age equivalent. And we measured selenium in their toenails, and we measured genetic damage in the prostate gland. This is a randomized feeding trial so we could study the association between selenium and genetic damage. And what did we find? For the first time, and we published this in 2005, that this relationship is U-shaped. So more selenium is not necessarily better in protecting against genetic damage. So, is this U-shaped dose response peculiar to selenium in prostate cancer prevention? I would tell you that if you look around, you will find many things in your world that are U-shaped. I'll show you a few. Here's the relationship between sleep duration and mortality in 82,000 nurses. It's U-shaped. You don't want to sleep too much, and you don't want to sleep too little. Here's the relationship between blood glucose at the time of your heart attack and whether you survive. You don't want to have too high blood glucose. You don't want to be too low. Here's the relationship between cholesterol in the blood and mortality in men. Again, U-shaped. High cholesterol is not so good in terms of mortality. Likewise, low cholesterol, not very good. Then we have this cottage industry known as low T or low testosterone. And what does that look like? I grabbed two papers out of the literature, one looking at the relationship between serum testosterone levels in the blood of men and their cognitive function and the aggressiveness of prostate cancers they develop. And what is the relationship? Both of them are U-shaped. So this idea that if your testosterone is low, you just need more and more and more would push you in this direction too far, and you would lose this optimization of both cognitive function and cancer protection. For those of you in the humanities, even Salvador Dali's mustache is U-shaped. Fast forward again to the SELECT trial. It was halted early. 8 years into the study, they called it quits because the interim analysis showed that the men were not benefiting from the supplementation, and there was a possibility that the men who were receiving selenium were having adverse effects, namely increased risk for diabetes. So you could read these things in USA Today. Vitamins get F in cancer prevention. So the trial was a bust, apparently. So what happened? Well, we asked the question that when it comes to the unexpected results of SELECT, is there a chance that we're just lost? So if you're in a mall in Vancouver and you're lost, you look for this sign and you're no longer lost. And if you're at the battlefield at Gettysburg and lost, you look for this sign and now you're no longer lost. If you're the average guy in SELECT before supplementation, this is where you are in terms of your selenium status, already in the optimal range. And if you're the average guy in SELECT after supplementation, you've supplemented yourself all the way out there. Wow. So, is it an unexpected result or an expected result that the men did not benefit from selenium supplementation? Well, we had to write a letter to the participants in the trial. And in the letter it said this: we now know that selenium and vitamin E do not prevent prostate cancer. You think that's what we know? I say we know there are no monotone values in biology. And you can't expect to optimize somebody's aging or health if they're already in an optimal range for that particular nutrient or activity level. We wrote a letter to the AMA journal and said, come on, come clean and say this is an expected result. 4 years later, this paper was published in the Journal of National Cancer Institute showing that the men in SELECT who had the highest selenium levels prior to supplementation doubled their prostate cancer risk by supplementing with selenium. We need more U-shaped thinking, right? We need more U-shaped thinking. All right, let's look at naive substitution. Is this clock real? Really? Okay. All right, naive substitution, and let's look at a couple examples of this. Let's look at the example of estrogen and cognitive function. There's a whole bunch of scientific evidence that estrogen promotes cognitive function in animal models and also in women. So the Women's Health Initiative did a randomized clinical trial to see if supplementing women with estrogen would delay their onset of dementia or prevent the development of dementia. It didn't work. But the Women's Health Initiative didn't test estrogen. They tested estrogen and progestogen combination. That's naive substitution. And we do it all the time. So let's think about this, vitamin E and cognitive function. There's a study that was published in the AMA journal looking at how does vitamin E status influence the development of dementia. And it turned out that there was a good association between the amount of vitamin E in the diet and protection against cognitive function, but not total vitamin E, diet plus supplements. How do you explain it? There was really no explanation in the AMA paper, but perhaps we could explain it that the vast majority of vitamin E that comes from food is gamma tocopherol, and the vast majority of vitamin E that comes from supplements is alpha tocopherol, a different form of vitamin E. That's naive substitution, right? Because we weren't precise enough with our language to say, what form of vitamin E were we talking about? And then the final example here, body fat. There was a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine where investigators wanted to understand whether or not liposuction, surgically removing 30 pounds of subcutaneous fat from women, would change biomarkers of health, like blood pressure, cholesterol level, risk factors for cardiovascular events. Turned out it didn't work. No effect. Well, it's interesting because previous work in rodents had shown that if you surgically remove visceral fat, the fat around the liver and the intestines, you benefit the rats, you decrease their insulin resistance. But if you surgically remove an equivalent amount of subcutaneous fat under the skin, there's no beneficial effect. Because the metabolic consequences of having fat around your viscera are very different than having subcutaneous fat. So this study was a study of the effect of fat. Not really, it was a study of subcutaneous fat. And if your categories are at this level of sophistication, body fat, you see the world differently than if your level of sophistication is at the categories of visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. Okay, now my attempted synthesis. We've probed some of the aspects of the biology of successful aging. One of the words you came across is this idea of plasticity. I think Cody used it the other day. There's plasticity to longevity, so the choices we make matter. We should be in the business of trying to promote functional aging. And one of the questions that we're very interested in is the plasticity of longevity retained in advanced age. And that's one of the things that we're working on. I showed you that two of the important underutilized concepts for your conceptual framework, how you think about the biology of aging, should include life course perspective and whole organism thinking. We need new tools, new attitudes. I told you we're testing a new idea. It's extreme natural biology. It's trying to get clues. If you want to try to understand creativity, you wouldn't go around studying people with average creativity. You would study individuals with extreme creativity to try to get clues to the factors that impact creativity. That's what we're doing. At best, our investigations provide us with glimpses of nature. I suggested that we don't get much proof in science, just clues. And those clues enable us to ask a new set of questions. And so you should be placing high premium on developing your ability to respond to clues, to incomplete information, and not being paralyzed by incomplete information. You need to formulate the best beliefs and the best actions upon available information. The attitude of language precision is going to help you immensely here. It's going to help you to develop how you respond to new information. I told you our words are our starting points for your practice today, for our inquiry in the future. We see the world through our categories. How do you see it? Do you see the world flat or round? Is that your starting point? Do you see leukemia as one disease or 15 different diseases? If you're trained to see leukemia as one disease, I don't think you're very well positioned to find a new form of leukemia. But instead, if your categories tell you there are 15 types of leukemia, you're ready to discover that 16th form, because there's nothing magical about 15. And our ovaries, reproductive units, or endocrine organs. Your categories influence how you think and what we can discover. I tell my students the way we choose to use language is the way we choose to live. And one of the things that we choose is this: how can we live the most creative life? And that brings us to this concept of that creative life that we're looking for might hinge on becoming a delicate sieve. And delicate sieve is a term that was first linked with creativity by this gentleman. This is Henri Procare. He's a French mathematician. And Poincare wrote a book called Science and Method in 1908. And he was very, very interested in the creative process in mathematics. And he was working very, very hard on coming up with some new thinking in mathematics. And he was struggling. And in his book, he writes this. He was struggling with his idea, so he had to leave his idea. Thereupon, I left for Mont Valérien, where I had to serve my time in the army. And so my mind was preoccupied with very different matters. One day, as I was crossing the street, the solution of the difficulty which had brought me to a standstill came to me at once. He's walking across the street while he's a soldier. I did not try to fathom it immediately, and it was only after my service was finished that I returned to the question. I had all the elements and had only to assemble and arrange them. Accordingly, I composed my definitive treatise at a single sitting and without any difficulty. So, Poincare's dilemma, our dilemma, is this, isn't it? Is creativity the product of calculated work or some sort of out-of-the-blue, spontaneous enlightenment? And after considerable thought, Poincare concludes, creative accomplishment requires both the intentional effort and spontaneous illumination. So, this is what creativity looks like, the creative process to Poincare. You have your experiences, past and present. You've generated ideas. You've worked hard to accumulate that experience. But then comes this spontaneous element of creativity. First, it starts with these blind combinatorial acts. You have these ideas in your head. If you have 2 lonely ideas in your head, the only combinations is this. But what if you have 100 ideas in your head? Then you have all sorts of banging going on. And those are the potential fruitful ideas. Now, you need a mechanism to single out what will be the best, most fruitful idea. And that's Poincare's selection apparatus, or delicate sieve. And then that idea rises to the top, and you have your aha moment, your creative inspiration. But you're not done yet, because then that has to be followed by the hard work of refining and validating that creative idea. And also, you need to express that creative product as something that you do, make, or say. So what do you think of Poincare's process? The penguin guy in the back is marching back and forth, and I think that means there's something missing. And there is something missing. It's the trigger to the whole thing. And the trigger is this. It's your pre-commitment to the situation of interest. It's your pre-commitment to a particular, sufficiently particular idea. You just don't walk around and say, I'm going to do something creative about vitamin E. You say, the problem that's on my mind is this interaction between vitamin E and exercise. Now that sets the stage. Why? Because that language is the language that governs what your sieve is and what idea bubbles up so it's appropriate to the problem that you're pursuing. So now we must ask, what are the factors that are critical to shaping the creative process and put in motion this pre-commitment and experiences? And as no surprise, it's language. You have to be sufficiently particular in your initial problem so that you create constraint. Creativity comes from constraint, not just this thinking out of the box. So your language provides that particular context, the constraint that drives forward the process, because context is always particular, never generalized. You don't train older adults. You train particular older adults. And you titrate the program and the assessment to the particular context. So, I've shown you today that science is a method limited by language, and hopefully you will now entertain the idea that creativity is a method that's limited by language. I'm going to skip through this session in the interest of time. Okay, I said that the attitude of language precision is fundamental to the optional functioning of the sieve. There is no universal sieve. My sieve, your sieve is going to be different. My sieve in 5 different situations is going to be different, and it's going to be shaped by your precision with language and your ability to sufficiently constrain that original problem. Okay, we must develop an exactitude with language. Is it going to be easy? Well, we turn to this guy, I.A. Richards, a literary critic from back in the 1930s who did more to study the ambiguity of words. The ambiguity of words. And there's no doubt about it that words we use are ambiguous, and so we talk past one another. How about the definition of peruse? Can you give me a definition of peruse? To just scan. Okay, go to the dictionary. The dictionary definition of peruse is to examine carefully. Oh, but just this year, Merriam-Webster added to examine casually. Okay, so do you see the ambiguity in language? And Richards was so bold to say, here's the 103 most important words in our language. And then he drops the bombshell. The most important words are the most ambiguous. So we'll never be able to squeeze all the ambiguity out of the words as long as we're using the important ones. So when you're in a meeting and you seem to be talking past one another, take a break and give people a hug and say, well, at least we're focused on the important words. That's why it's so ambiguous. That's why it's so troubling. So we have to work hard. We have to recognize the ambiguity, try to squeeze it out, but with the important words, it will never completely go away. Poets play up ambiguity. Scientists try to completely squeeze it out. I'm telling you, we'll never be able to squeeze it out. I showed you the power of neologism, making new words. Why is it so important? It indicates ownership. You have to be thinking really hard about your problem or your way of solving it to come up with a new word to describe it. And you need to think about how neologism can work for you. Okay, so final thought now. So how will I end an uncommon talk at an uncommon meeting? I guess it makes sense that I would talk about something or present something about how we create the uncommon. And Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about this 150 years ago about heroism. The characteristic of heroism is persistency. All men have wandering impulses, fits and starts of generosity, but when you've chosen your part, abide by it, and do not weakly try to reconcile yourself with the world. The heroic cannot be the common, nor the common the heroic. Adhere to your own act and congratulate yourself if you have done something strange and extravagant and broken the monotony of a decorous age. I think Emerson was saying, do something heroic. I think FAI is all about this. Do something heroic with your training. I think what I tried to impress upon you today is this. Do something heroic with language. And I'll stop there.
We might have a time for like one or two quick questions. I have a question.
Yep.
So there's just a lot of material and content. Is there, for sort of the lay person who's not necessarily in academia or exposed to a lot of these studies, any resources where you might suggest we look to keep up on these types of things?
All right, did everybody hear the question? The question was, okay, how can you get the very best information from all the information that is available? That is problematic. I think I spoke to a couple people at dinner last night, and I talked about what I call the Rolodex theory of health. You're only as good as the talented people who are in your Rolodex. In other words, the people that you can contact that can give you guidance and interpret the new findings as they come along. But remember, when it comes to health, wellness, disease prevention, that's not the physician's strong point. So you and your clients are going to have to take more and more responsibility to try to make sense of the new information as it's coming along. Remember, the information research is a process, not a thing. So will be always changing and always uncertain. But you can't be paralyzed by that and say, well, I was trained this way, and we'll just have to wait for another study. You have to reshape your beliefs. And that's why I'm saying precision with language will enable you. If you can develop that, you will be able to develop a better way of responding to new information. And that's the name of the game.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waters.
I just want to clarify, I did not say pelicans, okay? That's not what I said.
That's an admission.
But I do ask you one question. All right, so talking about the genetic contribution to longevity, what about those supercentenarians? You know, do they have basically a genetic advantage for achieving that super longevity that we see those 110 to 120-year-olds?
Yeah, so the question is, genetic studies on supercentenarians or centenarians, has that revealed any specific genetic variations that promote this? What's very interesting about this, there's a paper that was published where people said, okay, we're not sure if people that live to be 100 have a slower rate of aging, but they certainly have disease resistance. Okay? Disease resistance is a fundamental part of exceptional longevity. Now they looked at hundreds of different variations in genes that affect the susceptibility or resistance to major diseases in people, like cardiovascular disease, cancer, whatever. And then they compared 90, 95, 100-year-old people to the general population, and there was no difference. Yeah, we have to keep going. We have to keep going, right? And remember, if genetics account for only 25 or 30%, it's not going to be one gene. It's going to be multiple genes. And so no single gene is going to have a particularly major effect compared to the 70% that might come from lifestyle changes. I think what the work points to is there's not a single way of achieving highly successful aging. There's probably 15 paths. And so I need to figure out whether Cody has antioxidant defenses covered, but his screw up is protein misfolding. And so that's what I have to address. The intervention that will help him with that will be his key. But another person will benefit greatly from antioxidant supplements because they have lousy antioxidant defenses. Who will benefit? That's the key question. It's heterogeneity. I think Cody said that older adults are the most heterogeneous. They're the most different population. And so we have to focus on the particulars. Okay.
Thank you.